Yat shiye Tylar yanishe, Belagana nishle, Nakai dashache, Belagana dashanale, I bespechahe dashache. So my name is Tyler Rodriguez. I just introduced myself in Navajo, not because I am from Navajo, but that is a community that I spent a lot of time in my first couple years in New Mexico. I was originally born for Jill and Russ Rodriguez. My father is Latino and Yaqui Indian, and my mother is, we would say, Bilagana or Anglo from the East Coast of New Jersey. I went to school at Miami of Ohio University and got a degree in environmental science and geology. And then I moved to New Mexico through the Teach for America with an opportunity with them to teach in a small community called Navajo, New Mexico. And I choose to introduce myself in Navajo because it was in Navajo that I learned how to advocate for Indigenous youth, how to understand Indigenous education. And that community very much was instrumental in understanding an identity within me that I didn't yet understand. An Indigenous identity, an identity based on education and youth. And so I choose to introduce myself in that way, not only to pay respect for that language, but also to honor an identity that I've become to grow into. My first year teaching, I went and visited Naka on a school visit, and I was immediately taken back by just how well the vision in a school could be lived out, not just through its teachers, which is a very easy thing to happen, but through an admin level, through a teacher level, and then through a student level. My first visit, I was blown away by the fact that students could articulate why, not only why they were in school, but why an Indigenous education was relevant. And for me, I always knew that if I ever had the opportunity to come to Naka, I would take it. And so 3 years after teaching in Navajo, I came to Naka to teach 6th and 8th grade science. For me, I understand science as being an avenue for understanding the world. For me, it's really a lens. There's no defined criteria for what is and what isn't science, and there's this dichotomous relationship between what we view as science in modern context and Indigenous epistemologies and ideas, especially spiritual ones. For me, I view science as a way to merge those two things together rather than keep them distinctly separate. Science is all about observing phenomenon and trying to come up with an interpretation. And what we try to communicate in my science classes, especially with 6th grade and 8th grade, since they're coming into science, is we try to get them to look at what are the facts and what are the observations that they can make, and then ground them in both an Indigenous interpretation as well as a modern context for those things, knowing that both of them coincide together and they're not mutually exclusive of one another. So for example, when we look at geology, we often look at Indigenous stories and look at First Nation stories for describing volcanoes and other things like that, knowing that those interpretations were absolutely correct based on the evidence that was there. And then we look at it through a modern context or a scientific lens. Neither of them discredit the other one, but they actually enhance each other because they're both valid interpretations. So that's kind of this idea that I've grown into since coming to Naka about what science can mean. I think on a wider level with Naka, the way we, in our science department, we view a lot of the things we do through an environmental lens. A lot of the Indigenous identity is based on the connection to land, and that connection to land both grounds our students as well as enhances their life experiences. And so a lot of the curriculum we try to put in place allows our students to both make connections to their own communities as well as the Albuquerque community, which is an urban community, which is again a little different for our students to understand. We're taking many kids who grew up in reservation communities, transplanting them to an urban campus and still expecting them to have this connection to land. And Naka fosters that through our science curriculum and gets students to engage in that both in a communal setting as well as in an urban setting. And if our students can navigate those things, we feel like they're better prepared for a life outside of their community and within their community as well. So one of the units we're doing right now with 8th graders is our energy sovereignty unit. And historically, thinking about 8th grade curriculum in the greater country context, this is a unit on energy and physics. And the lens that we're looking at is, well, can we connect it to energy sovereignty and real needs? They have understood energy sovereignty as the ability for a community, whether that community is a tribal community, a city community, an urban community, but any community, to control, regulate, and manage their own energy needs with a culturally responsive perspective. And so the easy way that the kids understand is, well, we should use clean energy. But what we're discovering with our kids is that clean energy doesn't always mean equity. And so we look at other nations like in Guatemala, in Mexico, and Malaysia, where alternative energy is being used, but is it being used responsibly in a way that's culturally responsive to those communities? And we found out that it's not. And our students are becoming very knowledgeable of the fact that bringing solar panels to their reservations in New Mexico, while is great, that doesn't necessarily equate to energy sovereignty. And so we have them looking at different texts, analyzing what are good examples of energy sovereignty and what are still examples of energy security. And we see that now with current issues, and so they're connecting that to what's going on in North Dakota, what's going on with pipelines across the country and in different parts of the world. And so they're developing this idea of energy not as a thing that we need and use, but as a power that binds us and connects us in multiple ways. And we need to treat that out of a level of respect, not out of a consumer mentality where you just take it and take it and take it. And so one of the activities they've recently done is where they've analyzed quotes from text, looking at what is the author saying, what does this author really mean, and connecting it to energy sovereignty. And then they developed a tweet, 140 characters or less, where they had to reflect on what does this quote mean for me. And these tweets are really important because it gives them an opportunity to openly express any feelings they have towards energy security or energy sovereignty, and seeing that it's not just about alternative energies. There's a responsible way to do it, and we need to understand that because they ultimately will be the advocates for their community. And so that's like one of the big units that we focus on with 8th graders, as it ultimately gives them a really strong stepping stone in terms of their writing, but as well as their understanding of science as a social issue and not just a limited science perspective. I think early on, I was an easy adapter of like, what's the new trending thing in education? So whether that was foldables or project-based assessments or, whatever the hot topic was then. And I think coming to NACA has made me realize doing what seems cool isn't always effective. And I think for me, it came back to grounding myself in the sense that culturally responsive education needs to be responsive to the students' needs and understanding. And while that seems really obvious, it's easy to get far away from that in how you assess kids. So when it comes to developing alternative assessments, I really try to hit on what are the things that my students already naturally do, and how do we use that to give them an avenue to express their learning in a way that's comfortable for them. So tweeting, while many of my kids don't have Twitters, the idea of a hashtag is something that they're really responsible of. Often they talk in hashtags during the day. So having a tweet gives the opportunity to say, okay, I need to develop a meaningful reflection, but I still get to own my tweet at the very end with a hashtag that I feel like is important. And while I gave them some examples to use, many of the students developed their own hashtag like Protect Dapple or Native Pride or Land Before Energy. And that was their entire creation. I think other assessments really just have to be responsible for, is the outcome you're asking a student to reach, is that happening through your assessment? Sometimes it has to happen through a quiz because you gotta know, can you align these definitions with a meaningful example so we can have a greater conversation later. Other times it's, I want you to develop this research project and I want you to really think about what is an issue that your community is facing and tie it back. Even if the science or the content isn't always there, if we can get them to apply what they're learning in meaningful ways, we create a longer lasting impact than we do just assessing them. Do they understand some basic foundational principles of science, which although I love and find interesting, I don't know how applicable they always are if you don't pursue a career in science. I was very awakened to the fact that I'm allowed to be my genuine self. And when I do that, I open up avenues to really understand what my kids are going through. And some of the things we do is our catalyst, which is a daily warm-up. Some days it's science themes, other days it's just about getting to know where they're at. So Mondays are always motivational Mondays. We look at motivational quotes. Tuesdays are Thinker Tuesdays, where we learn about a famous thinker, usually an indigenous person or a person of color or a female scientist, which none of the kids can ever name. And Wednesdays are Would You Rathers, and we propose ethical questions to them. Again, not necessarily science related, but it gets their brains to engage in a different kind of way instead of just asking, write down the definition for the words that we did yesterday. Thursdays are like Riddle Me Thursdays, and my kids very early understood that they hate riddles, but it's become this running thing for us of like, yeah, riddles are really hard, but it's really fun to engage your brain and look outside the box. And then Friday, we align to our NACA core values of reflection. So I like to use my catalyst often as a way to kind of not only gauge where my students are emotionally when they come into that space, but also find out a little bit more what makes them tick. When I've got 117 kids and I can't always do that throughout a day, I can look at their catalyst either at the end of the week or really pay attention to their responses, and I can be much more responsive to that because I'm giving them a genuine way to articulate a feeling instead of asking, hey, you seem upset today, what's going on? Most sixth graders will never understand what they're feeling, but if I say, would you rather impose these two ethical situations, I can immediately cue on this student's having a rough day based on how they responded to this question. And then I can go and approach those needs. And a lot of what we do in the science department, again, is community-based. So when we talk about community issues, when we talk about the content, we always tie it back to something that they might be experiencing in their community. Even if their community is an urban setting, that connection allows me to really see, based on how they respond, what community they live in, what kind of family guidance are they getting, what kind of support do they get at home? Is their education basically their own responsibility, or are they like other families where they get a lot of support at home? We talk about this idea of there's a spectrum of indigenous students, kids who are really culturally involved and kids who have no cultural connection. There's also a spectrum of what factors will influence kids when they come in. A parent's getting divorced might not affect one kid, but another kid might be going through an emotional wreck for the next 3 months because of that. And it's our duty as teachers, especially in an Indigenous education environment, to not say that it's a one method treat all or it's a blanket approach. We have to view those two kids, and if we know how they tick, we can better tailor an approach for them that meets their needs. I like to say that my classroom is controlled chaos. I've tried to be a little better when it comes to management, but I understand that for me, a quiet, focused classroom that has no social component would be very detrimental because I'm such an extrovert. The best part of my day is the moment when I get to talk to my kids. I love telling stories. I love having them tell stories. I've had more classes than I can probably count that have been just completely moved off that track of what I wanted to do because we had a conversation and it just kind of took us to a different place. I'd like my classrooms to feel like the students have control to engage as long as they're engaging responsibly. So I wouldn't say that it's always oh yeah, talk to whoever you want. I like their conversations to be geared towards what we're learning, but I don't try to regulate how they do that. A lot of what we do is we jump around to a lot of different media formats. It's posters, it's technology, it's videos, it's demonstration, it's music. And that is mostly a product of some of my favorite science classes, which were a lot of controlled chaos. While I grew up loving science and I love lecture, take notes, do an experiment, that's home for me. I also realized that part of what made me interested in science, not what I learned the most in, but what made me interested in science, was my crazy, nuts 7th grade teacher and my earth science teacher that I took as an elective because I was the only senior who wanted to take earth science. They were amazingly different and very weird in their own ways, but that is what grounded me to say science should be fun and science should be inquiry-based. And so while I have to kind of unlearn this lecture, note, experiment type of learning that I really enjoyed because I love science, realize my kids who are really into literature don't engage in that way. So doing Samian matter charts, looking at texts written by indigenous writers for news publications and analyzing the purpose behind those, while I don't find nearly as engaging, I know that meets some of my students' needs. So we try to get a mix of both really rigorous science laboratory experiments as well as kind of abstract theoretical meaning behind text and looking at kind of the broader perspective of science and what it does and what it doesn't do. So I guess going back to it, controlled chaos. Some days it feels like I'm not sure what we learned, and then there's other days when I feel like we've jumped leaps and bounds forward in one lesson just because they finally put all the pieces together. And those are obviously the really special moments for teachers. If I had a hope or a dream for my students is that they understand that science is not a body of knowledge, but it's a way of thinking. And a quote that I always start my year with my students and I always end with is a quote by Neil deGrasse Tyson. He has 2 goals in his life. It's no more tomorrow or no more today than he knew yesterday and lessen the suffering of others. And I guess I would love for my students to walk away with their high school and for their education to say that science is solely a way to lessen the suffering of others, whether that's through physics, chemistry, medicine. It is a way to impact a greater community outside of yourself and outside of like self-profit and self-worth and self-value. You can impact such a larger community through science. And I really hope students, even if they don't pursue careers in STEM, that they can walk away appreciating that science is an avenue that's not to be afraid of, it's not to be considered culturally taboo. It is a way that if you take the time to understand it, you take the time to think and reflect on how science works, it is truly an amazing way to impact greater communities and have a long-lasting impact on their community, their environment, and whatever they really think about or find value in.